I wanted to thank Meta and Jeff for inviting me to participate in this panel as your host. This is a panel to celebrate the very recent H. France Salon, Surviving the French Revolution, Strategies and Meanings. We have our panelists here today, and we have two wonderful commentators who have volunteered to give us a solid 10 to 12 minutes of commentary, after which I will open the floor to discussion so that the panelists, the authors of the papers, will be able to respond to the commentary, and people who are visiting can ask questions. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first commenter. That is David Andrus, who's a professor of modern history at the University of Portsmouth. He's author and editor of numerous books, most recently the Routledge Handbook of the French Revolution. He also has a couple of good history books out under popular presses. He has published more articles in more different outlets than I can keep track of. He is currently at work on a fascinating topic that is the topic of trust or confiance before and during the French Revolution, looking at it both from political angles and from cultural angles. And I'm looking forward to seeing more articles. I know that there's one in the pipeline. I don't know when it's going to come out, but I'm looking forward to it. With no further ado, David, you are welcome to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Bob. And thank you again to Meta and Jeff for inviting me to comment here. Thanks to the authors for providing so much rich food for thought. And I'm just going to scatter a few thoughts over what they've done for the next 10 minutes, just to sort of warm everybody up. So I'm doing a kind of auto cue thing here on a second screen. So excuse me if I look up. The word that drifted into my mind as I was reflecting on all these contributions was substrate, which is etymologically what lies beneath. Has a set of other meanings which I think might all be relevant here. In geology, a substrate is an underlying set of formations that give their shape to the visible landscape above. In computer engineering, it's a solid base material to which all the complexities of processing systems are physically anchored. In biology, it's a surface to which living things anchor themselves and from which they draw sustenance. And revolutionary politics, as we all know, continuously tried to push human interactions into an oddly arid realm of both hyper-individualism, no trade unions, no political candidacies and so forth, and submergence of the individual, a worship of the nation, a sense of militant self-sacrifice unto death, and so on. And those who tried to live on this thin air alone, like perhaps Saint-Just in 1794, backed themselves into some terrible corners, marching victims to the guillotine while fantasizing in their notebooks about a future realm of static agrarian harmony from which a man would be banished for having no friends. Alongside and beneath that, as the accounts that we've talking about here and many others show, most people, even those quite closely linked to those airless peaks of radicalism, kept at least some of their roots in the rich loam of social life, where ways of being that were quite emphatically not created out of whole revolutionary cloth enabled them to endure at least and prosper at best. This also reminds us usefully that the French Revolution happened to people who lived in a pre-industrial, pre-class society, and while some of its vocabulary suggested otherwise, it's only by misreading the 1780s and 90s through the imagination of people who lived several generations later that we can pretend that their experience was modern. The absolute continuity of Parisian demands for a state-regulated food system from the flower war of the 1770s through July and October 1789 into 1793, the maximum and the horrors of the 1794-5 famine, in a constant battle with modernizing authorities who held a free market to be an unalloyed good, despite never having seen one in operation, is a case in point on the grand scale. At a smaller scale, one might point to the interesting life of Adrien-Joseph Colson, recently illuminated by Tim Tackett, someone entirely embedded in service to noble patrons, to the extent of never establishing a household of his own, but also entirely embedded in a network of proximate neighbourhood community, an urban village which dissected rumoured external threats obsessively and which found refuge from them in apparently unquestioning allegiance to what later generations would insist was a popular movement, but which also looks quite like those older, longer-term mobilisations familiar to historians from the pre-revolutionary policing of Paris. And community, neighbourhood, family and household all take their places in the materials under examination here, along with the more nebulous but extraordinarily important construction of networks, as things which in many cases are all that is left when public politics has resolutely failed. I was struck in Marisa Linton's paper by the remarkable courage of Elizabeth Lebas and her furious insistence on the moral rectitude of the man she'd married and of the circle of men her family had welcomed. Her rage at the idea that she and her kin might have been involved with anything less upright pours from the page, overwhelming any sense that any specifically political issues might have been at stake. And of course, as Marisa touches gently on, it was the abiding capacity of the Dupleix circle to manage its own survival through events which could easily have annihilated them that would see Elizabeth's son transform his tragic heritage into genteel scholarly distinction. And this is paralleled by Alexandre Rousselin and his well-positioned offspring, their distinction the fruit of his absolutely relentless networking, ably classified by Jeff Horn, through a series of adventures that might have been picaresque had Alexandre not worked so very hard to keep himself out of danger. That the elder of those offspring was born out of wedlock as part of a sequence of events that bound Rousselin to the aristocratic family of Paul Barras, opens up the interesting question of sexuality across all these survivors. It's striking how little the revolution seemed to have done to alter patterns of sexual conduct that might seem to have been firmly embedded in old regime mores. Charlotte Robespierre's outrage at the married woman who we suppose was seduced by her brother is almost touching when one looks ahead to the full-blown revival of elite public libertinism in the later 1790s, one which placed the ever-active Rousselin on a dangerous list of the future empress's lovers. In this context, and the one in which Christine Adams has documented the effectively public existence of a selection of remarkably beautiful women as both actors and objects amongst an essentially masculine elite, I wonder how far it's a matter of bourgeois social identity that Denise Davidson's subjects appear as relentless cultivators of legitimate intergenerational solidity, and how much that might be a feature of a corpus of materials exchanged between mother and son-in-law. That kind of correspondence reminded me also of what I've been recently reading in the letters of Rosalie Julien, which are a torrent of maternal feeling, allied from 1789 with an increasingly ardent conviction that a radical Jacobin politics is a route to survival, the route to survival. But what also intriguingly emerges from reading her letters through and past Thermidor Year 2 is how much her maternal concern for her son's advancement and safety predominates. In the spring of 1793, she roared her hatred of the Girondins in the name of an implausible 8 million Parisians, and by that autumn, she was enthusiastically supporting throwing the family's lot in with service to Robespierre. But by spring 1794, we see on the one hand her letters reporting favourable personal interactions with leading Robespierrists, and on the other, repeated exhortations for Marc-Antoine to be careful and to avoid putting a foot wrong. By early July 1794, she's writing both of continued patriotic joy at the actions of the Committee of Public Safety and cryptically labelling a friend who'd arrived with news of Marc-Antoine as his courrier de confiance. By the 30th of July, after the paroxysm, she was condemning the infamous Robespierre and noting that her son had prophesied the faction's fall, perhaps in some of those confidential letters. Those misled by the incorruptible were now imbecile enthusiasts. Before the end of the month of Thermidor, she was drafting letters to public figures near and far, in which the stern Republican morality she'd encouraged Marc-Antoine to display in the service of the committee was now invoked as the reason he should not be punished for that deadly work. Letters, of course, that may indeed have contributed to saving his life. A final note of caution in reflecting on survival and the lack thereof through the thing we might call the terror is that a great deal of it was horribly random. From the Parisian street level, we have the account of the glazier Ménétrin, who quaked in fear throughout 1792-4, while also serving as a stout sans-culotte office holder and National Guard, and was at a loss to explain in his memoirs why so many of his friends and neighbours had been killed by what seemed no more than personal vendettas. Wider work on the victims of the terror and their attempts at agency have illustrated over and over again how documented factual innocence could secure acquittal in one case and be cast aside in another, and how many of the last letters before the scaffold dwelt on the plaintive claim that it was all some kind of inexplicable mistake, if not yet again the product of personal malice. And beyond questions of literal survival, some of the grimmest pages of Richard Cobb's work show how stereotypical outsiders, dangerous men by any account, were swept up to enjoy their weeks or months of unaccountable power, only to be cast aside, and in some cases literally cast out of communities as the political winds turned. The difference between them and a Rousselin or a Julien lay perhaps less in what they'd done as revolutionaries and more in that substrate I began with, the soil of common life that, as Wordsworth invoked it, became too hot for some to walk on, even as others ploughed their furrows into future generations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments, David. I'm sure that we will return to those in a few minutes. I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our next commentator, who is Karine Rance, who comes to us as a maîtresse de conférence en histoire contemporaine at the University of Clermont-Ferrand. You know her as the author of many, many book chapters and the editor of 2 books, and she has placed articles in the Annales historiques de la Révolution française, as well as in French historical studies. I look forward to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I will be speaking in French. I couldn't find the time to prepare an English version of my text. So sorry, and I know quite a lot of the people attending this session, and I know your English is far better than your French is better than my English. So I hope it's not going to be a problem. So. Let's begin now. Alors, je voudrais remercier pour commencer Matt Harder et Jeff Horn qui m'ont invité à ce salon. J'aime beaucoup le principe de ces réunions en visio, effectivement, avec beaucoup de décalage pour plusieurs d'entre nous. Et c'est un plaisir de retrouver, comme je le disais, plusieurs de collègues avec lesquels j'ai eu l'occasion de travailler à Bruxelles, Charlottesville dans des colloques ou à l'occasion de publications. Alors, je signale pour répondre à Robert Blackman que David Andrus a publié récemment dans les AHRF, dans un numéro que j'ai piloté, avec Dennis Davidson, d'ailleurs, qui présente aussi donc un article sur la confiance. Donc, vous pouvez lire dans les annales historiques de cette année, je crois. Voilà, alors j'ai lu avec grand intérêt les articles, les 5 articles qui m'ont été soumis pour cette deuxième partie du salon qui porte sur le sens de la survie. Alors moi, la première question que je me suis posée, c'était de savoir s'il existait un groupe qu'on pourrait désigner comme étant les survivants, puisque c'est quelque chose qui revient régulièrement dans les différents papiers. Cela renvoie évidemment au parallèle, avec un parallèle qui a été fait avec les victimes de la Shoah, que Matt Harder et Jeff Horn font avec toutes les précautions nécessaires pour bien rappeler qu'il n'est pas question de renvoyer dos à dos la révolution et les terrorismes du XXe siècle, comme certains ont pu le faire, mais de s'inspirer d'un questionnement et d'une méthodologie. Alors, pour qu'il existe une catégorie de survivants, il faudrait que ces individus partagent un champ d'expérience commun, pour reprendre le terme de Reinhard Koselleck. Alors, on a bien des groupes qui se dessinent, comme celui des conventionnels régicides relapse, qu'étudie Metharder, mais qu'ont ces hommes en commun avec d'autres catégories d'acteurs politiques ayant survécu également à la période révolutionnaire. La question, elle se pose avec une acuité particulière dans le cas de la guerre civile, qui n'est pas abordée ici, et j'ai trouvé que c'était dommage parce que là, on a un face-à-face entre des acteurs qui sont dans des camps opposés et dont les survivants n'auraient pu se sentir avoir une expérience partagée que une fois les blessures refermées. Or, c'était impossible en Vendée ou dans d'autres sites de guerre civile, c'était impossible à cause des instrumentalisations qui ont perduré parfois jusqu'à aujourd'hui en ce qui concerne la Vendée. Deuxième question générale, c'est à partir de quelle date peut-on considérer que quelqu'un est un survivant ou qu'il meurt prématurément? Les violences, elles ne cessent pas avant la Révolution et la Terreur blanche des années 1815-1816. Euh, alors dans ce cas, est-ce que ces individus survivent à la Révolution, comme c'est le titre du salon, ou est-ce qu'ils survivent aux violences politiques du quart de siècle qui sépare la prise de la Bastille de la loi qui est dite d'amnistie de 1816? Est-ce que survivre signifie en fait échapper à une condamnation ou à une répression à un moment d'extrême violence politique à l'encontre des acteurs de la vie publique? Ronan Steinberg, dans son article sur Sade, apporte à ce questionnement un élément intéressant en rappelant qu'initialement, on ne survit pas, en français en tout cas, à un événement, mais à quelqu'un dont on hérite. Donc l'héritage peut être matériel, forme de bien, ou idéal, c'est une mémoire ou une idéologie révolutionnaire ou contre-révolutionnaire. Alors on peut survivre à un proche. Kirsty Carpenter présente le cas de Marie-Joseph Chénier qui survit à son frère André. Comme beaucoup de familles, celle des Chénier était traversée par des oppositions politiques qui divisaient toute la société française. Mais on peut survivre aussi à ses pairs. C'est le cas des conventionnels qui sont étudiés par Metharder. Dans les deux cas, les individus qui restent, donc qui survivent, sont porteurs d'une mémoire et d'une culpabilité qui s'avère pesante. Cette mémoire et cette culpabilité qui leur sont propres, en tant qu'elles sont issues de leur expérience, mais elles leur sont aussi imposées par les contemporains qui les jugent en même temps qu'ils font le procès de la Révolution française. C'est le cas des partisans de Robespierre après Thermidor, de tous ceux qui sont compromis à l'époque napoléonienne pour leur activité pendant l'an 2 ou à la veille du coup d'État de Brumaire, de ceux qui sont désignés comme régicides relapses par la loi dite d'amnistie 1816 dont j'ai parlé tout à l'heure. Alors, ces survivants, ils peuvent être donc des perdants, voire des vaincus, et ils sont en ce cas souvent ostracisés par la société, par leur clan, par leur famille. C'est le cas de Sade ou celui des conventionnels bannis. L'échec personnel me paraît en revanche très relatif pour ce qui est de Marie-Joseph Chénier, qui entre à l'Académie à l'époque napoléonienne. Sade, pour sa part, avait vraiment tout perdu durant la décennie révolutionnaire. Ronan Steinberg affirme que le fait d'être un outsider est ce qui a permis à Sade de survivre. Auréolé d'un séjour à la Bastille sur lettre de cachet à la fin de l'Ancien Régime, il s'engage avec enthousiasme dans la Révolution jusqu'à être de nouveau arrêté pour modérantisme en 1793. L'intervention de sa maîtresse et la probable corruption de quelques agents semblent lui avoir évité in extremis une comparution devant le tribunal. Alors, on peut se demander, je demanderai à Ronan Steinberg, si le fait d'être un outsider est ce qui lui a sauvé la vie, ou si ce n'est pas sa survie Qui fait de lui un outsider? Et cette question, elle vaut aussi pour Marie-Joseph Chénier. Chénier est en effet en opposition avec la majeure partie de sa famille qui a opté pour le royalisme, à commencer par son frère André. Après avoir réussi à protéger un autre frère et son père, Marie-Joseph échoue à sauver André, qui est notoirement engagé dans des activités contre-révolutionnaires. Kirsty Carpenter soulève ici un point intéressant. En rappelant avec Marisa Linton, mais aussi Haim Burstein, que le sacrifice de soi est un moteur des protagonistes révolutionnaires, Kirsty Carpenter souligne le traumatisme vécu par Marie-Joseph Chénier, incapable de sauver son frère. Effectivement, la vertu révolutionnaire imposait de faire prévaloir la fraternité politique sur les liens familiaux. Est-ce qu'ils se sentent coupables non, pardon. Est-ce parce qu'il se sent coupable que Marie-Joseph se montre particulièrement virulent à l'encontre des émigrés en 1795, comme l'écrit Kirsty Carpenter? Ou est-ce plutôt une stratégie destinée à préserver sa situation, si ce n'est sa vie, à un moment où des accointances royalistes représentent encore un danger? S'il est des survivants perdants, il en est qui sortent gagnants de la période révolutionnaire. Le juge de Saint-Martin, qu'étudie David Troyansky, en fait partie, il fait partie de ces gagnants, à mon avis. Il est le maillon d'une continuité familiale qui s'inscrit sur 4 générations de magistrats. Il a pu et il a su transmettre cet héritage notabiliaire d'Ancien Régime, au-delà de la Révolution, à son propre fils. Cette survie politique, là, il la doit à sa flexibilité politique. Il a su non seulement assurer la pérennité d'une implantation régionale, son fils sera maire de Limoges dans les années 1820, mais il a su accroître aussi la fortune familiale par l'acquisition de biens nationaux. Il a su également se mettre à l'abri au bon moment en se réfugiant sur ses terres. Est-ce que tout ça fait de lui un survivant, comme l'écrit David Troyansky? Pour moi, juge incarne la figure de la girouette qui a été étudiée par Pierre Cernat. Alors, est-ce qu'il faut voir dans la girouette un survivant de la Révolution? Juge de Saint-Martin rappelle Montlosier par sa volonté de gagner les faveurs de Napoléon à travers la rédaction d'un livre historique faisant l'éloge du nouveau maître de la France. Il y inscrit sa propre trajectoire, révisée dans l'histoire longue du Limousin. Il applaudit aux nouveautés de faible portée, tout en promettant 50 ans de progrès à la France, car, écrit-il, ce qui est futur est dans la cause. Une belle formule qui fait l'éloge donc de Napoléon. Mais il fait du récit de sa propre vie ou survie, ça reste à discuter, une vie qui est inscrite dans le cours de l'histoire de la Révolution française, un tremplin pour une réussite individuelle à venir. Cette imbrication des temporalités se retrouve dans l'étude que livre Matt Harder des conventionnels bannis. Alors que Napoléon Bonaparte puis les Bourbons ont voulu faire taire les voix radicales, ces hommes tentent en exil de préserver la mémoire de la Révolution. Paradoxalement, Baudot et Barrère, sur lesquels elle travaille, mêlent leur voix à celle de Saint-Just, qui était leur adversaire. Alors qu'ils sont ostracisés par le gouvernement français et par leur famille, ils ont le sentiment d'avoir fait corps en tant que députés. Barrère ne considère-t-il pas la mort de certains membres de la Convention comme une mutilation? Cela forme un groupe désigné comme tel aussi par leurs accusateurs, donc les conventionnels. Ils sont entachés de régicide, porteurs d'un tabou politique. Ils partagent une expérience commune, celle de la Convention, puis celle de l'adhésion à Napoléon pendant les 100 jours. Mais l'horizon d'attente de ces hommes déjà âgés n'est pas la réintégration politique, c'est la postérité. Ils veulent transmettre leur héritage idéologique et leur mémoire révolutionnaire dans toute sa complexité et sa conflictualité. D'où la transmission des notes et carnets manuscrits de Saint-Just et même les commentaires qu'en fait Baudot dans ses propres notes. Alors, j'aurais encore un point à souligner ici. Quand Ronan Steinberg déclarait qu'on survivait initialement à un proche, il faudrait ajouter qu'on peut survivre malgré un proche. Car ici, Baudot et Barrère ont veillé à écarter les héritiers naturels de Saint-Just de ces manuscrits. Comme bien d'autres conventionnels, ils font bien plus confiance à leur père qu'à leur famille pour préserver l'héritage révolutionnaire. L'horizon d'attente n'est certes pas le même pour ces hommes âgés et bannis de leur patrie et pour des acteurs plus jeunes qui ont un avenir devant eux. Comme l'écrivent les éditeurs de ce salon, Jeff Horn et Matt Harder, les acteurs politiques n'avaient pas la même marge de manœuvre en fonction de leur genre et de leur classe également. Et on peut d'ailleurs s'étonner de l'absence des femmes dans cet ensemble de 5 articles, hormis la douzaine de femmes qu'évoque brièvement Howard Brown dans son article. Alors on pourrait ajouter à l'inégalité des chances de survie la dimension raciale qu'évoque Ian Collard à propos de Zamor, le nègre de la Dubarry, entre guillemets évidemment, dans un livre que j'ai enfin il a publié cet article dans un livre que j'ai récemment édité avec Éric Saunier sur race et révolution française, si je puis me permettre de l'évoquer. Alors, la survie, elle ne dépend pas uniquement de l'agency d'un acteur. Howard Brown rappelle le poids des autorités qui décident de ceux qui peuvent vivre et de ceux qui doivent être écartés de la vie publique, soit par une condamnation à mort, soit par l'exclusion du territoire national. La trajectoire de Fouché se trouve précisément à la rencontre de sa propre capacité d'action et de ses stratégies politiques, enfin des stratégies politiques qui font de lui un acteur de premier plan de l'époque napoléonienne et au-delà. Par stratégie politique, en l'occurrence, j'entends celle de Napoléon. Il se trouve en situation d'épargner ceux dont les compétences peuvent lui être utiles et d'envoyer d'autres acteurs finalement moins marqués par la Révolution française à Cayenne ou aux Seychelles. Howard Brown s'interroge sur les critères qui ont conduit à la condamnation d'opposants politiques entre 1799 et 1802, critères qui, en creux, expliquent la raison de la survie des autres personnes, des autres acteurs. Il observe 3 vagues de condamnation. Donc celle qui a lieu au lendemain du coup d'État du 18 Brumaire, la seconde une semaine plus tard, qui concerne 49 hommes, qui condamne 49 hommes à l'exil, et puis la troisième, après l'attentat raté de la rue Nicaise, qui condamne là 130 hommes à la déportation. C'est la fameuse guillotine sèche, tant le taux de mortalité était élevé, soit pendant le voyage, soit à l'arrivée. Un taux de mortalité qui encourageait les évasions. Alors elles ont eu lieu. Et là, je me suis posé une question, parce qu'après des condamnations si dures, on s'étonne que les hommes qui ont quitté les Seychelles et la Guyane, les premiers suite à une évasion, les seconds légalement, que ces hommes, une fois arrivés en France, soient simplement mis sous surveillance. Alors, peut-être qu'Howard Brown pourra revenir sur cette question. Pour moi, cette réponse faible qui est apportée au retour des déportés renforce l'impression d'opacité, voire d'arbitraire, qui préside aux condamnations. Howard Brown arrive à une conclusion très intéressante à ce sujet. Pour lui, les condamnations visent à trouver des victimes expiatoires pour mettre fin aux violences, qu'elles émanent d'un État punitif ou d'une société assoiffée de vengeance. Comme avec la loi de 1816, il s'agit de désigner des coupables pour épargner les autres acteurs et mettre fin au cycle de violence.
Excusez-moi.
Oui, j'ai terminé. Je suis désolée si j'ai débordé. J'ai juste un mot pour finir parce que j'ai trouvé intéressant sur ces 5 articles que il y avait des figures qui ressortaient, celle de la girouette, celle du profiteur, celle de l'outsider. Je pense qu'on pourrait ajouter celle de l'immigré d'ailleurs. Euh, et donc, c'est un portrait très négatif qui ressort de ces survivants. Et on peut se demander si c'est pas leur statut de survivant qui informe finalement cette image négative. Et je vous prie d'excuser ma longueur, j'ai pas regardé l'heure du tout.
Thank you very much. Those were wonderful comments. What I would like to do now is ask the audience to raise your hands as you would wish to respond to the comments by David and by Karim, or if you would like to ask a question of the authors themselves, either would be perfectly fine. You can use the react button to raise your hand if you would like. Peter, you'd go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Thank you.
if I could, yes, kick things off. Thank you very much for those wonderful comments, fascinating, and really supported what the authors of the contributions had to say in terms of undermining this notion of ruptures during the revolutionary period, which have the same meaning for everybody. We know from the work of Meta Harder and Michel Biard and others the way in which, for example, the violence of the terror continued well after July 1794. But my one suggestion about all this is that it's useful perhaps to think in terms of what historians of time, historians of temporality, have got to say. In other words, the very notion of being a survivor requires one to have a particular understanding of time passing in a particular way, of something being behind one. And if you look at, for example, the letters of Julien that David was talking about, the agitation, the sense of urgency that are there in the spring of 1794, afterwards, of course, that dissipates. There are very different notions of time once one feels that one is looking back on the revolutionary period. So I think as I was reading those papers, I kept thinking of the different ways in which the protagonists that people have been evoking here might have thought about time passing and what passages of time actually meant, the history of temporality. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Would anyone care to respond to Peter's comment, or Jeff, please?
First of all, thank you to everybody for showing up. Thank you to David and to Karine for their wonderful comments. Peter, I'm really stimulated by your question. I think that that's something I wish we'd thought of. What it brings to mind to me is Rousselin's correspondence with Madame de Staël and with Benjamin Constant, where they explicitly talk about their different sense of time based on whether they were kind of in or out of the charmed circle of people who mattered, and that exile made time stretch out abominably. So I really think that your observation is something we should have talked about, and if we move forward, I think that it's something we will try and think about, because the different experiences of time would complicate a lot of what we're doing. So thank you.
Ronan, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, also about time. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for being here, and to Jeff and Meta for organizing, for letting me be part of this. Peter, I was thinking as you were talking that of course, one of the interesting things that I think Lynn Hunt is here, maybe on another screen for me, so I can't see her right now. But I think Lynn had written once, maybe in one of her AHA presidential addresses or something, about how many sources in the revolution, primary sources of various people from various walks of life, all expressed a similar notion of time going fast, right? That it's impossible to describe because time is going fast. Time is going fast. Curiously, the Marquis de Sade also brought that up in 1801, though, in a text that I do not quote in my short essay. It's a text that he wrote on the novel, on the literary genre of the novel. But he does say that the French Revolution basically made the Gothic novel, the genre of the Gothic novel, obsolete. It wasn't true, but that's what he said in 1801, that it made the Gothic novel obsolete, because he said, who can compete with what reality was? There's not one person, no novelist could describe what one person experienced in 3 days. During the revolution, no novelist could, capture that. So that sense of, my point is that they thought, I don't know how consciously they thought about temporality, but they certainly talked about it a great deal and made comments about it, right? And we see that, by the way, in other revolutionary moments. You see similar expressions in 1968 about time going fast and things like that, right? So in moments of rupture, as you said, you brought up in your comment, it's just reflections that I have in reaction to what you said. Yeah.
Thank you, Ronan. Next, we have Meta.
Sorry, it takes me forever to find buttons. Okay, yes, I wanted to thank everybody for their comments so far, and particularly David and Karine. I'm so grateful that they took the time to read all the contributions and write these comments. I know it's really a big workload. And I'm also hoping that there'll be time for all the contributors to respond to the detailed comments on their papers. But I wanted to say just a few things. One was that I was really taken by Karine's comment that we need to look in more detail into the problem of survivors as a category, which was something that Jeff and I discussed at quite some length. And I think in a way, I don't know, argue is a strong word, but we did kind of go back and forth a little bit about how to address that in our introduction. How do we tackle that problem of talking about survivors as a category in regard to the revolution, particularly as we're so used to that term being used in regard to other events in history, particularly the Holocaust. We really struggled with that. And the other comment that Karine made that really interested me was, did surviving the revolution and whether that's, you know, just the revolution or that longer period all the way to 1815, did that actually make you an outsider? Or did you already have to be an outsider to survive the revolution in some kind of way? And it made me think of a trip to the Père Lachaise that I took several years ago. And I was looking for the grave of a particular revolutionary that I'm interested in, who was Jean Lambert Tallien, whom I've worked on quite a bit. And it took me a long time to find the grave. And while I was doing that, I found the graves of many other Thermidorian survivors. And, you know, many of these graves are really overgrown and neglected. I mean, they're completely falling apart. These are not heroes' graves, you know, they're kind of tucked away in corners. And one of them is, you know, the grave of Barras. And I just thought, you know, it really is no good to survive a revolution because you just get forgotten. And in some sense, in a way, you lose your revolutionary identity, I think, if you don't die in the revolution. So, you know, I this comment about that survivors are outsiders, or in some sense, you know, they're not very popular. It makes me think about, you know, is it actually necessary in order to be a true revolutionary to actually die in the course of a revolution? And that interests me. And finally, I just wanted to respond to, I think, a smaller point that David made, but which really interested me, which was that connection, or just something that's interesting, which is sexuality and survival. And I've been thinking more and more about sexuality in the revolution, which I think is still really under-researched. And Barras is a person that kind of pops up again, and I think we talk about him relatively often, but we don't talk a lot about his sexuality. He's one of the few, I hesitate to use the modern term, but he's one of the few bisexuals that we know about in the revolution. And of course, we also have de Sade, who was another one. So I don't know, that's perhaps not something that you want to discuss today. We have very little time, but it was just an interesting point that came up. And so thank you, David, for mentioning that.
Thank you, Meta. Our next participant will be David Troyansky. Why don't you go ahead, and David?
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks to Meta and Jeff. Thanks to David. Thanks to Karine. There were some things that Karine said that I'd love to respond to. That was really a helpful comment. And also the comment that Peter made. I was struggling once I started working on Juge de Saint-Martin with what category to put him in. And Karine well knows that one of them was in a conference that she co-organized on reconversion sociale, and it had me thinking about how to tell the story that way. And then with Jeff and Meta on the idea of surviving, I had the idea of girouette in the back of my mind, but it does have a negative connotation, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do that. And one of the things I was interested in particularly as he goes from one edition to another in writing about a 50-year period, and that gets at the temporality question, is what gets repeated and what gets edited out, and to what extent is he in the story he's telling about the period. And I've just found these different ideas useful, and I'm still not sure where I'm landing on this. But one of the things that I think is important is that Juge is thinking about a rather long period of time. For some reason, thinking of what's a half a century, which makes it a little bit different from some of the others where there's this more immediate reaction and everything seems to change. The other factor is that he's older than the other folks that are discussed here for the most part. He was born in the 1740s. And so what do we do with someone who has matured in the old regime and then finds himself being in a position possibly to be a girouette in the revolution and then living to the 1820s? I'm still playing with all of that, but I just wanted to thank you all.
Thank you, David. The next person to speak will be Howard Brown. After that, Rodney Dean, and then Professor Matlock.
So let me add my thanks to the organizers, the commentators. These are fairly extensive undertakings, and I certainly appreciate the time committed to all of our scholarship. In this case, I'd like to draw attention to a connection that I can make pretty quickly between what Karine was saying about the victimes expiratoires, those people who were deported and many of whom died, especially after the Nivos assassinat. But the time factor that Peter raised makes it kind of interesting to focus on those who did not end up dying in the Seychelles or in Guyana, but rather made it back to France. Many of them made it back to France in 1811, because the British conquered the islands on which they were being held. And then they found their way back to France, and they were, yes, put under police surveillance. But one would imagine that by that time, if we don't have the hindsight of 2015 or 1815, 1816, that this may have been enough time to put some of those feelings of vengeance, some of that expiation really aside. And France may well have been on its road to healing much better than we might imagine if we take out of the picture 1815 and the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire and that sort of thing. So I think the matter of time, like grieving, is an important factor in terms of survival and attitudes that are adopted to the people who have survived and on the part of the survivors themselves. The time that elapses allows them to come to terms with some of things that happened and position themselves in the new society, potentially the new society that wants to get over the past. But thank you for the comments.
Our next question is coming from Rodney Dean. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, from Stockport in Manchester. We've been going for about 45 minutes, but no one has mentioned anything other than almost the survival of politicians. What about the survivors of dechristianization, which carry on really until it was resolved by Napoleon in his negotiations for the Concordat? I am particularly interested in the Abbé Grégoire, famous for his resistance to give up his faith in December 1793. I am interested in how he survived the terror. Was he supported by Robespierre? We don't know, but he became a member of the Comité d'Instruction Publique. But then we have virtually the civil war over religion, which went on right through the Directory. And it was only Napoleon that was able to bring it to some sort of closure by the appointment of 12 constitutional bishops who survived dechristianization and carried on the, if you like, the Republican Catholic faith. And one of them survived till 1841, Belmas, and many of them survived much, much later. So I just wonder if there is anyone investigating how the people who had faith survived both the terror and dechristianization. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Matlock. You had a question?
There we go. I don't so much have a question. I have many questions, but I have a comment. On the one hand, I wanted to say that these papers were all fabulous, and they left me with lots of questions, and we could probably go on for 2 more hours. And I'm very grateful for your putting this salon on. It happened that just before the pandemic, I was working on miniatures that were created in the Revolutionary era, basically from 1789 up through 1805. And I was trying to figure out how much it cost you, the cheapest you could get one painted, and how that changed. And so I pulled up a bunch of issues of Les Petites Affiches looking for people advertising that they'd paint your miniature. And it threw me that I found in them endless lost and found notices. And I ended up writing an extensive piece which was a qualitative and quantitative study of lost miniature objects in the 12-year period between 1793 and 1805. But in order to survive the boredom of reading and tabulating lost dogs along with lost miniatures, I also read extensively the sections of Les Petites Affiches where people talked about needing jobs or needing money or needing help. And one of the things that was absolutely stunning, particularly between year 3 and the first year of the Directory, were how many ads there were, sometimes which went on with discussions about the individuals who advertised for as long as a month or 6 weeks, where people talked about having lost their whole family or lost their closest friends, or how incredibly lonely they were. And in some cases, you could probably reconstruct from information about them, things about their class, even technically their age, rarely their names, and rarely their location, but they were always in Paris. These were Les Petites Affiches de Paris. But the period of roughly 3 years is just a gold mine for everyday descriptions of people who survived and their experiences of survival. And I'm not going to write on it. So, I share this, go for it. It's amazing. Some of them are just so moving. I sat there in the BN. Most of it, of the period that I'm talking about, you have to read in hard copy. There's only a small section from 1793 that's been digitized. And even if it were digitized, you wouldn't be able to word search it. You'd still just have to do what I was doing, kind of going through page by page. But there was one guy in particular who said, I've lost my whole family. I'm 60 years old. And I just want a friend. And he kind of describes himself and talks about wanting somebody to talk to. So all of which is to say that there are astonishing kinds of sources like that we might not think to look at. And that one is particularly rich, I think.
Thank you, Professor Matlock. Now, I see that Jeff and Ronan have raised their hands again. So I just wanted to see if there was someone who hasn't spoken yet who would like an opportunity to ask a question or respond before I move on to Jeff. Lynn, if you would like to speak.
Yes, if I can figure out how to unmute myself. That's speaking of buttons. I want to go back to something that Karine brought up that I thought was extremely interesting, and we haven't come back to it. The term gagnant, the winners, which she referred to in reference to David Troyansky's Judge. I believe saying essentially, are we really talking about survivors in that situation, or are we talking about winners? So it's a really actually a really interesting question. I think it also applies to Rousselin, by the way. And in that sense, it certainly applies to Napoleon. We could say that Napoleon was a survivor. I mean, he had his brief moment where things looked really bad for him, but we never think about him as a survivor. We only think about him as a winner. So I thought one of the things that Karine did that was so interesting was to raise the issue about whether we're talking about outsiders, whether we're talking about survivors, outsiders, winners, girouette, or what exactly? In other words, there's a definitional issue, and I thought she made that especially clear by bringing up at the very beginning something that no one has sort of picked up on, and that was sort of not talking about the Civil War and the fact that there has been an enormous instrumentalization of survivorship in reference to the Vendée and the other instances of civil war, which is very different from all of these pieces, which talk much more about people who at some point or another supported the revolution and then had to pay for their support of the revolution, even if it was that they had to figure out a way of getting their way around it in order to go forward. So I thought that was interesting that these kinds of cases in these wonderful papers and wonderful comments for that matter really don't lend themselves to instrumentalization in the same way. It's more, so the stories are much more about, as she put it, culpability, a sense of guilt, about what to do to rehabilitate yourself and your reputation. So I thought it was interesting that these cases all fall in a certain area that leaves out other kinds of survivorship. And I wondered if Mette and Jeff wanted to say a little bit more about why they decided to go that way.
Thank you, Lynn. We will ask Chris her question or get her response, and then we'll move on to Jeff.
Yeah, I guess in some ways I'm responding to what Lynn had to say here, the question of winners and what constitutes winning in a sense, because in one sense, I guess the women that I was looking at were winners, that they became sort of celebrities in the wake of the revolution, but fairly short term, right? I mean, these people who survive, I mean, and I was sort of looking at surviving and thriving, that you have the four women I focused on who came out of the revolution, who sort of make a name for themselves, who become celebrities, who become, involved in society. Josephine is certainly a winner for a time, hitching her wagon to Napoleon, as it turns out, although she may not have thought that was going to happen at the time that she married him. Thérèse Italien for a time too, certainly makes a name for herself. Juliette Recamier probably a little later. But celebrity is fleeting. And so I have a hard time, and also the other thing I was sort of thinking of is how people make use of their revolutionary experience. You mentioned culpability. Tracy Italian comes out sort of mythologizing herself as the person who saved people, who was Notre Dame de Bon Secours, that she is able to sort of parlay that into a kind of fame as well. And so it's complicated because people have such different experiences and different ways of treating their behavior during the revolution. And because people have such polarized views on what constituted good behavior during the revolution too, that becomes a complicated issue. So there's all these, I mean, it's just such a great topic, and I'm really so grateful that Jeff and Meta did put this together, because it does raise these really interesting things to sort of think through. And as we're living in very messy times today, it's sort of interesting to look at a past time that was also very messy, and how we sort of play around with our roles and perspectives. So anyway.
Thank you, Chris. Now, Jeff, you've been waiting very patiently. Would it be all right if we let Denise speak first? Thank you. Denise?
Thanks. Yeah, so I thought I would respond to this question about civil war, if you're willing to let me define what happened in Lyon as a kind of civil war, right? The Federalist uprising comes pretty close. And so one interesting illustrative example that could kind of reflect on the experience of civil war in that context is that two of the men at the center of my story, and one is Louis Vité, who was a diehard Republican but anti-Jacobin, voted against the king's execution at the convention and then had to flee into Switzerland in exile. He comes back and ends up on the Conseil des 500 and so on. So he returns to politics until 1799 when he withdraws. Anyway, the other man is Claude Arnaud-Tizon. I don't know too much about his political views exactly, but he was a municipal officer working with Louis Vité when he was mayor of Lyon in the early years of the revolution, and then steps out of politics for a while. And again, I don't have any way to know exactly what he was thinking or what motivated him, but he ended up returning as a municipal officer when the Jacobins had dominated the municipality. So he's a Jacobin, at least he's willing to work with the Jacobins. He was briefly arrested, so he could have been killed after Thermidor. But he survived, as did Louis Vité, and then they went on to marry their son and daughter to each other. So I think it's interesting that I think one point that my study of these families illustrates is that sometimes I think we assume that political affiliations were more kind of hard and set than they really were. And I'm not sure that means that they were girouettes. They just, they could put politics aside, as maybe people do at their Thanksgiving tables these days here in the United States, right? But also maybe that they could see each other nonetheless as allies, right? Once they make it to the other side, right? Their son and daughter marry each other in 1801. So anyway, one reflection on surviving a form of civil war.
Thank you, Denise. I have to say my Thanksgiving tables have been very different than that. Jeff?
What interesting comments we've been hearing. So I want to respond briefly to Rodney Dean, and then I will offer a few comments about what Lynn was asking about. Meta may have additional comments as well. So the book that my paper is drawn from talks a lot about the survivors of dechristianization and about their deep attachment to the politics of vengeance, and that the politics of vengeance for these survivors is going to long survive 1801. I think that frequently the Concordat is overestimated in terms of the way that it did not tamp down the religious conflict in many localities. And so the conflict about the survivors of dechristianization, the survivors of the revolution, the survivors of the terror, the survivors of however many different things we want to identify, they're really going at each other, at least in the Aube, until the 1830s. So I think that this is a much longer term conflict and division and political touchstone than we have recognized. The trauma, to evoke Ronan's work, doesn't go away so fast. And so I think that that's important to remember, but I do appreciate the question. Lynn, when we came up with the idea for doing this in David Andrus's seminar, we were thinking about the revolutionaries. So it was very much drawn from the range of experience of the revolutionaries. That said, your question is absolutely on point in trying to think about what this all means. You know, I personally see this as one trial of the concept. I think that there could be, and hopefully will be, others that will kind of complicate and enrich our understanding of what this means in different ways to try and get at the diversity of French political culture in this period. But I really liked your question. Thank you for giving it to us.
Oh, Christine, and then Christy Carpenter.
Yeah, I'll jump in quick. I mean, I have to add my thanks to Meta and Jeff. This was just such an interesting project to be involved with from the beginning. And I was not somebody writing about one of the revolutionaries, so I'm glad you broadened out your scope a little bit. I really appreciated the comments and questions on definitional issues. I'm going to keep pondering those. I really appreciated David Andrus's comments about the role of family and sexuality in all this, ensuring that, not just the individual, but the family unit survives into the next generation. That was certainly important for the story that I'm writing about. But I'd kind of like to go back to something that Ronan wrote about in his piece. Well, actually, two things. In reading through these essays the other day, what I really noticed more than when we were presenting necessarily in Detroit last spring, or a year ago, last spring, was the class of all of these individuals, right? They are all bourgeois, individuals, families of the kind that Denise is writing about. And so I'm just wondering if, people think there's a possibility for opening up this notion of survivorship to, more ordinary French peasants, artisans, etc., or whether it just really applies to elites who, are more engaged in revolutionary politics in one way or another. And then the thing that I wanted to go back to is Ronan's comment about randomness, because a lot of the discussion has turned around, people reflecting after the fact on how they managed to survive, and whether their politics are still the same, and whether they're trying to preserve their revolutionary identity or erase it in some way. But that all assumes a certain, level of agency and reflection. And I do think, at least in my story, but I think in many of the other stories that were written about here, there is at least a certain amount of accident, contingency, randomness, and we may be overstating, the amount of choice that some of these actors had, at least throughout the whole period. So I just wanted to raise that issue.
Thank you very much, Christine. Our next question will come from Christy Carpenter.
Hi. I'd like to thank everybody for a fabulous panel, and particularly Matt and Jeff for organising it. I'd just like to come back to one thing that Karen brought up that hasn't come back. And this is this issue that's so closely associated with anything emigre, which is about the notion of outsiders and about the persecuted. And I think if you mix that up with David's comments at the beginning, you're looking at something that shows you how fluid the kind of geography of that substrata was. It wasn't only the emigres who had this intense feeling of exclusion. exclusion was something that could happen right in the center of Paris. It could happen in the Civil War. It could happen in all these theaters. And while time was important, it was for these people who were subject to the guillotine within 24 hours that time really came to a head, because it was stated in the legislation. And I think that's where you sort of have got to go into the nuances of these definitions and come back to these issues of time, and also to the sort of the traditional attitudes that memoirs that have been written after the event are somehow coloured. The emigres ones are repetitious and boring often. But do we apply that to the memoirs of Barrère, for instance? And Barrère was kind to Marc-Joseph Chenier, who they weren't particular friends, but looking back on the issues, he said no, he could testify that Chenier had bitterly cried about the death of his brother, which was an unusual reflection to make. And some of these little snippets that alert you to the fact that these strands of the arguments and the strands of thought about different themes and how we overlay them in these lives, I think also brings you back to the fact that many of these individuals turned inwards. They turned inwards and focused on their private lives, their absolutely closest family members, and avoided contact where they didn't have to, where they weren't absolutely obliged to go out and get it. And this sort of inward turning effect, I think we can also see in some of the conflicts around us. So I won't say more about that, but that was something that also hasn't come back so much as this, the arrival of the intensely private person.
Thank you, Christy. I think we have enough time to handle 3 more questions, if that's all right. We can start with Suzanne.
Thanks. Yeah, this is fun. So I have 2 questions. One is, it seems to me interesting that in the last few years, there's been more and more work on individuals. And I wonder if anybody who contributed to this wants to reflect on why that's the case. Individuals' experience of the revolution or their stories of the revolution, and how do we put them together? Okay, so that's one question. The second thing is, I think I want to join, or when I was looking at this material, the word survival, one can't use surviving the French Revolution without it implicit meaning surviving the terror. And that seems to me to be kind of lurking behind this discussion and people's uneasiness with the word. I think I share that uneasiness. Why isn't it? How did people navigate their world after 1794 or reinvent themselves in the aftermath of the disruption of the revolution? Why? Because by using the word survivor, we're really narrowing the revolution down to, I think, the disruption and the destruction of the terror. So I think if the authors, the editors go on to turn this into a book or something, seems like that kind of needs to be problematized more. I was really also curious what Marissa thought about that, because in some ways, it seems like a reaction to wanting to diversify the nature of the terror. It sort of narrows it back. I may be misreading. I could be misreading, but this was a reaction that I had, and that I think is kind of lurking behind this discussion as well. The papers are really rich, so I'm not by questioning the word survivor, I'm not meaning to question the value and the richness of the contribution, but just kind of want to problematize, which I think Karine was trying to do doing at the beginning of her comments as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Suzanne. Denise, you had a second comment? I'm sorry, Meta, actually, you had a second comment. Did we lose Meta?
No, I'm just not able to, hit the
there you are. You moved on my screen.
Yeah, sorry. I don't want to jump in though if Marisa maybe wants to reply.
I would like to reply, but I can't figure out how to raise my hand.
All right.
Why don't you go ahead first?
Is that all right, Denise? All right. Go ahead, Marisa.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I do apologize for my cat. She's also quite savage, so if I try and move her, she'll probably start scratching me. And I know she keeps presenting as I'm so embarrassed by her. She's just yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, yes, people obviously can survive all sorts of things, and I think one of the richness of all these contributions is that they talk about different kinds of survival. It isn't just about terror or the terror, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes it might be about sorry, I'm actually going to try and get away from her. She's really distracting me. I mean, in the case of Charlotte Robespierre, for example, once she escapes the immediate threat of being executed after her brothers, it's also about how she gets by when she's ostracized by everybody. There may be a threat of death, but there's also afterwards as a question of how you go on living and what you do in order to carry on living and what that means and whether it's worth it. And I really think there's so much to be said about the particular problem of revolutionary women and children, because in many cases they don't choose any of this, and yet they have to carry the fallout. And they may not be threatened with death, but they've still got to confront the neighbors and they've still got to live. And that's a kind of survival that's really important in their lives, and they have to make decisions about what they will do. I also wanted to ask Meta, of course, love what you said about Saint-Just, thought it was fascinating. And I just wondered, you did mention, Barrère, he could have sent those papers. I mean, he'd helped kill this man. Okay, so he could have sent the papers on to Saint-Just's female relatives. His only close surviving relatives are women, but kind of maybe he thought that wouldn't work. And this whole question of women who become, who inherit the papers, and what are they going to do with them? And are they going to stick their heads above the parapet because of the kind of the social ostracism that might ensue? And I will now mute myself because I just can't, figure out the hand thing. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you, Marisa. And now back to Meta, and then we'll finish up with Denise.
Okay, all right. I don't want to take up so much time because I know Denise is next. Maybe I'll just answer Marisa's. Well, I'm not sure there's a question there about the issue of Saint-Just's papers, and so maybe for those who haven't read the chapter, but the issue is that Barrère, who had contributed to Saint-Just's death on 9th of Thermidor, actually later came into the possession of some very important papers that had been in Saint-Just's apartment and had been taken from there after his death. And it's very strange that, Barrère, as one of the perpetrators of 9th of Thermidor, held on to these papers and did not return them perhaps to the family, or, in any case was in possession of them. And I don't really know if there's a question there, but that was that was kind of the point that fascinated me, that now was it because at the heart of it seems to be that perhaps there was a sense of remorse, or perhaps not a sense of remorse. I mean, if you feel that you're entitled to hold on to these papers rather than passing them on to the actual relatives of the man, maybe he actually didn't feel that bad. I really puzzled with that notion. But we need to talk about it more, I think. I wanted to reply to the question about the instrumentalization of survivorship that Carine had raised and that Lynn had picked up on. And I do think that, that was something that Jeff and I had really wanted to avoid in this salon that we were both interested in. And in some sense, we avoided, I think, traditional narratives that might focus on the stories of the immigré or the refractory priests. Though, having finished the salon, I actually felt those stories were missing. I agree with what Rodney Dean said. You know, these are important actors whose stories maybe should have been there, but telling those stories would have dragged us back to centering on the terror, which, you know, I do see as a problem, as you know, as what was brought up by Suzanne, and I think that is an important point. One thought that I had was perhaps the survivorship has been instrumentalized in this way because almost every person, I think, who survived the revolution felt that they had been victimized by it. I mean, I really struggle to think of a group of people who did not come out of it at the other end and did not perceive of themselves as some kind of victim. And you know, the people that I wrote about, I mean, until his execution, I think Saint-Just did think of himself as a victim, and he wrote about that and feeling sorry for himself quite a bit. And I think both Barrère and Baudot saw themselves as victims. And I think one way we can address that is to try to tell all the stories as much as we can and listen to them. And I was very interested in the moments when these individuals or groups of people have these moments of insights, when they stop thinking like that just for a very short time. And that's when something really interesting happens. And we have this momentary reflection on, you know, oh, maybe, you know, maybe I wasn't the only victim, or, oh, maybe I victimized someone else. And those can be very short moments, and they appear in the documents. And, you know, then they move back to their narratives that they have become very used to. But that is the stuff that I was interested in, and I think that was why Jeff and I wanted to do the Salon, though I can't speak for him. Thank you.
Thank you, Meta. I'm afraid we will not finish with Denise. We will finish with Howard. But I think that's where we'll have to end after Howard. Go ahead, Denise.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I thought you were going to just skip me, which would have been fine too. I have actually a very brief comment. There'll be plenty of time for Howard to make some remarks. It's actually in response to Christine's point about how most of our work has been, you know, all of our research pretty much focuses on people who are bourgeois, right, and of social class, and how to get to ordinary people. And it also connects to Suzanne's question about our focus on individuals. And in the end, it's about the source materials, right? Like I had this great collection of letters. Many of us are using letters in order to tell these stories. And so I was thinking that, you know, for the experience of ordinary people, probably the number one area in which they faced survival or not surviving would have been through conscription and military service, right? And so, and there we get, and it also then connects, I was thinking, and then, you know, when we're talking about survival, I use it in my book, I use the phrase survival strategies a lot. I also use the term navigating the revolutionary era and so on. But anyway, you know, they didn't really have a choice, right? They were conscripted, and then the nature of warfare meant was largely about chance, whether or not you're going to get hit with a musket bullet or whatever, right? So anyway, I think the issue is that, you know, that we don't have sources to get to them, and also that they weren't making conscious choices about how to survive. I mean, they were on the day-to-day level in terms of getting food and that sort of thing. But again, I thought that, just thinking about what Christine was saying, I was thinking that it'd be interesting to think more about conscription and military service and how ordinary soldiers did or did not attempt to survive in that context. And again, like everyone else, I want to thank everyone for being here, and thank Jeff and Meta for all their work. Stop there.
So I'll quickly jump in, and I'll keep my comments brief too. I think we're kind of missing Richard Cobb. He got mentioned by David. Sort of the seamier side of human behavior seems to be a little bit marginalized. Maybe there's a pudeur on our part. I'm not sure. Parrain, who was responsible for the military commission at Lyon, ends up not deported because he's working for Fouché, providing food to families of the militants so that he can spy on them. So he can report back to Fouché what they're up to and what networks they're part of and how active they are in this sort of thing. I think there was an awful lot of information exchanged for some leniency. I think I just yesterday read about to girls who were spared the firing squad in Angers because a couple of representatives of the Commission Militaire had come in drunk. They had sex with these girls and then they were spared. So, you know, these sorts of circumstances, real duress for food, for life, for spying on your neighbors, turning someone in, even selling out your family members, giving up your body, all these things we've kind of dodged in our bourgeois rectitude, I think. And Richard Cobb would have been all over this. So I'm just going to make that comment.
Thank you, Howard. And I think that's a fine place for us to stop with that extremely provocative moment. I wanted to thank Chris Adams for hosting us and setting up the Zoom. And thank Jeff and Meta for putting together this opportunity for us all to meet. I've really been, it's a pleasure to have heard all of your wonderful comments and thoughts and to have seen your cats. I want to make sure that we say that. And finally, I wanted to say thanks again to David Andrus and to Corinne Rance for the time they put into making the comments that are going to be so useful for our participants going forward. And with that, I look forward to seeing some of you at San Francisco next month and others of you in Paris next July. Until then, thank you very much.